what they miss otherwise.
And we should remind everybody to be muted.
Yes, if you can be muted when not speaking, because if you can mute yourself when not speaking, that would be helpful. Welcome to our legislative town hall and reporting on the last legislative session and the special session after that. A lot has happened and a lot of frustrations all around, but we'd like to have this chance to meet with you, hear concerns. I think each of us are sending out legislative reports that I hope you're getting, hope people are seeing them. We've had problems with the Senate systems in terms of email and everything. Apologize for that, and please try and let us know if you're having trouble getting communication from us or reaching us. I'll start with briefly. Each of the three of us represent Hollins and Hausman and myself. We'll speak for 5 minutes each or so, and then we're going to open it up for questions, comments, discussion. And we will ask that when people are making comments or questions that they try and keep it to about a minute. So it gives you a chance to express, because they don't have to be questions, they can be concerns or whatever about situations we're facing. With that, I'll go first and just say that this has been an awkward year and a half because of COVID. And it's not quite the same thing to be in person with people as it is by Zoom, but at least we have some opportunity this way. And there are advantages to this for people who have difficulty coming to the Capitol or coming to a meeting. So I do hope that in the future, we'll be able to do a blend where people can come in person, but can also participate by Zoom. And the Senate is going through those debates itself right now on how to do things. As you undoubtedly know, the end of the special session a month ago, the executive orders from the emergency are gone. They worked a wind down so we could deal with eviction issues, so we could not lose federal money from it. And it was the longest by a long shot, the longest emergency the state was under in state history. It's been a year and a half. There were lots of shots taken at the governor. I wouldn't want to be in his shoes. And no matter how he acted, whether he was stricter with the restrictions or weaker with the restrictions, he was getting hammered by it. And some people, I heard from a number of constituents, not too many, but some who said, oh, he was acting like a dictator and all kinds of terrible things. And shouldn't the legislature be doing this? And I've been saying all along, because the Senate has voted every month during every special session, whether to continue it or not. And I said, I'd be willing to end the executive orders if the legislature will step up and do its task. But like last July, a year ago in July, I offered legislation calling for a mask mandate. I figured it would be a great thing for the legislature to discuss. Should we have one? If so, how does it work? And where does it apply and everything else? They wouldn't give the bill a hearing. They wouldn't have any hearings on any of this. Instead, they say, well, governor can do it if he wants. So then the governor does it, and then they attack him for doing so unilaterally without involving the legislature. Having said all that, that is done now. I'm not confident that we're past COVID yet. I think we're still in the middle of a new wave, for which I'll make a pitch for people to get vaccinated if they're not. But I'm hoping that we can continue moving forward. The economy is picking up in a lot of ways, and I hope we're making progress. I want to talk about, I'll pick two issues I'll pick real quickly that I want to highlight that might not otherwise come forward. One of which is the budgeting process and our legislative process in general. I've been trying to change the way we do budgeting in the past 20 some years due to a legislative agreement among some Democrats and some Republicans. They put in place a thing saying that all budget forecasts have to include inflation for the revenue coming in, because we expect to get more revenue due to inflation. We have to factor that in. But any higher costs for expenditures due to inflation, we're not going to count that, which is kind of, well, it's a form of cooking the books. It makes things look better than they are. It inaccurately portrays what the needs are. And so like this year, the Senate budget, one that I did not support, came in for education with offering $152 million, I think it was, or $150 million more for education. But that's not counting inflation. Inflation over the 2-year period would have raised inflationary needs for the schools to keep the schools at the same level, inflation adjusted level, would require $500 million. So in effect, we were $350 million in cuts if schools were to provide the same services and pay the inflated costs for higher utilities, et cetera. And so inflation ought to be factored in. I had hoped to be chair of the finance committee. We're in the majority. Some of the finance committee lead. I can't change those now. I don't have the votes to do it, but I think that's important. And the other part of it is the process, is the single subject. When I was first elected many years ago, I would offer a lot of bills, and not all of them get hearing, but a lot of them would be heard. They'd pass, and I passed 7, 8 bills. Governor signs them into law. We used to pass at that time 400 or 500 bills a year. Nowadays, we pass about 50 bills a year. Some people might argue that's just because, oh, there's less interest in new regulation. We don't pass fewer laws. If you look at the book of the laws each year, it's about the same thickness. It's just we cram more and more things into fewer bills, and it's an unaccountable method. It lets leadership cut deals. At the end, it becomes the governor, majority leader, and the speaker of the House cut deals, and we can work on bills and nothing happens unless they give it the up or down thumb. And it's supposed to be a legislative process where every member has a say. And with that, the need for the other illustration I'm going to give is real quickly. I've been pushing for 2-3 years on catalytic converter theft. I've offered bills. I've asked for hearings. I can't get hearings on the bills. Finally tried it as a floor amendment to a budget bill, which is not a good way to do it, but it's the only way I could get it heard. They voted it down, saying it wasn't germane to the bill. Basically, the legislature passed a real minor pilot project related to catalytic converters when we had a proposal that law enforcement, that auto theft investigators, others thought would be a good solution to it. Matter of fact, they said it would be a model for how other states should deal with it. But we have 6 or 7 catalytic converter thefts a day in the city of St. Paul. Each person who's hit, it costs them $2,000 or $3,000. And the insurance industry, the law enforcement, everybody seemed to be in favor of it. And yet I couldn't get the bill heard. And that says something about how we have a process where we ignore half the people. I'm supposed to be in the opposition party or the minority party, not the enemy party, and yet we're treated that way, and they don't hear our bills. So that's my concerns, and I think I spent more than 5 minutes, so I apologize. We'll turn it over to Alice. You want to go next?
I will go next. We are the only divided legislature in the country, and so you've heard some of the frustration from Senator Marty about that. As a result of that, we didn't accomplish all we had hoped, but there was much that we did, and we'll focus on some of that. And I'll talk specifically about transportation and housing, because those are the 2 areas I serve on those committees and have had my most significant bills in those areas. In the area of transportation, you frequently hear a lot of emphasis on roads and bridges. And so I've tried to put a little more emphasis in public mass transit, in passenger rail, in safe routes to school, pedestrian and bike access and safety, all of those alternatives that we have sometimes underfunded or ignored. My specific bill that I authored, and which I've been working on for a couple of years, we finally accomplished this year, and that is the second train to Chicago. We needed to put 10 million into the bill to match 32 million from the federal government, and we're hoping to accomplish that this year. You may know the problem when the current train leaves the West Coast. It runs into weather problems in the Montana, Idaho area. Then it runs into freight problems in the Dakotas, and it often arrives very late in St. Paul, and that's not a very good way to start your trip to Chicago. The second train will leave every day from St. Paul. It will leave at the same time every day, and so it will be a more timely and effective way for that trip to happen. So I was grateful that we accomplished that. I chair the Housing, Finance and Policy Committee, and probably our biggest accomplishment there in terms of funding was $100 million in housing infrastructure bonds. Those are appropriation bonds that enable us to partner with nonprofits, and we leverage a lot of private money. As an example of some of those nonprofits, Lutheran Social Service, Catholic Charities, Common Bond, Beacon, Aon, they do amazing good work in the area of housing, and we have some creative work going on there. The need is so great, and across the entire continuum, we need to continue to work on this. We had a very small target for the finance bill. That's the finance bill funds the activity of Minnesota housing. And we were hoping for more there, but we did what we could with the target that we were given. Probably the biggest issue that we worked on and spent the most time on and was most difficult is what we refer to as the exit ramp for the eviction moratorium. At the time of when the pandemic started and people lost their jobs, many of those first workers worked in bars, restaurants, retail, and we know what their hourly salaries are. They were the first ones who were at risk. They're probably the group of workers that are one paycheck away from not being able to pay their rent. The moratorium on evictions that the governor instituted at that point so that we wouldn't have more homeless people did not forgive rent. And that meant those bills just kept adding up. And what we wanted to be assured of is that when the moratorium ended, we didn't have an eviction crisis with many, many homeless people. So one of the difficult pieces, mostly it was a timeline. How do we give people enough time? But one of the things we wanted to do was assure that there was a notice of eviction, that they would get a warning from the landlord. You owe this much, and you're going to be evicted on this date. And that we wanted to give the tenants enough time to acquire funding. Now, here's the good news. Last year in the regular session, we already had $100 million, which we targeted for this purpose. And we actually wrote right into the bill that should go directly to the landlords. We wanted to assure that, that this property was safe and secure for the tenants. Now we have even better news. In the recent funding from the federal government, we have now over $500 million. And by going to Rent Help MN, all of those tenants are able to access funding. And we wanted, in this exit ramp or off ramp, we wanted to allow enough time for that process to happen. Here's the dilemma. It's wonderful to have that federal funding, but if there's no human infrastructure to figure out how do we get that money out the door and to the right people, it takes a little bit of time. I think we're underway now. The last time I checked, 22 million had gone out the door, but eventually I think they want to get to the point where $1 million a day is going out, and hopefully we'll get to that point soon. This is an interesting thing about how out of touch Minnesota is with some of the tenant rights. I talked about having an eviction notice. All we managed to get is a temporary one that's going to operate during the time of the eviction moratorium and this off-ramp. 48 other states have a permanent eviction notice. 48 other states have a permanent eviction notice. Those tenants are protected. They are always notified to give them enough time to see if they can put the funding together or to find another place to live if that's the issue. Minnesota is one of only 2 states that do not provide that protection right now. So that's one of the leftover tenant protections I think that we didn't accomplish. Tenant protection in a number of areas should require much more effort on our part, and we'll take another go at next year. But for now, that's, I think I probably used up 5 minutes too. I think Representative Hollins?
Yep, I'm here. I had to unmute myself. And I feel like one thing that Chair Hausman isn't saying is like how hard she fought for every single thing that is included in that bill. Like it was no joke. Being opposed left and right, even on, as you noted, like some really common sense things that a lot of other states have adopted, and we are still struggling to catch up with the rest of the country. And I was just really impressed by, how well you fought, Chair Hausman. So sorry, I'm taking up my 5 minutes congratulating you, but I really appreciate your advocacy. So I'm Athena Hollins. I'm the new kid on the block, right? District 66B. And I think most of you probably know that I ran specifically on climate change and public safety. And unfortunately, those are both really big topics that are very hard to push. So we didn't quite get where I wanted to be on either one of these topics, but I do think that we made progress. Um, in public safety, I know there were a number of people who were really disappointed with how we did as far as police accountability, but we were able to create some police officer misconduct databases that'll create a more effective early warning systems to make sure that officers who are problematic are removed from the streets. And that's really important because a lot of studies have shown that the majority of police officer misconduct is conducted by a small percentage of the police officers. Most of our officers are amazing people who are ready and willing to serve our communities. There are just some bad apples. And so being able to collect that information is going to make a huge difference on being able to create safety for all of our communities. We also had provisions in there to require officers to engage with mental health crisis teams when the resources are available, as well as to have departments create policy on confidential informants. So all of these things are really important, and they create just a tighter system, making sure that we are looking at public safety from all angles and trying to make sure that that we're moving forward to make our communities as safe as possible. The other thing in the public safety realm that I was really excited about was the elimination of certain fines and fees and the removal of some civil asset forfeiture, the majority of civil asset forfeiture, actually. And so if you're not familiar with that, that would be when law enforcement and actually prosecutors' offices as well are allowed to take belongings in situations where there is a charge of a crime. So whether or not there's actually a conviction, they can actually take some of those belongings and keep them. And I've seen this firsthand because I interned at a prosecutor's office in my hometown. And at that time, I thought it was really innovative and a great sort of, backwards way to control crime, sort of like, behind the scenes. You don't have to arrest anybody necessarily or have them charged and convicted of a crime, and you can still take their cars. But what that ends up happening, what that ends up meaning is that individuals who are stuck in a cycle of poverty are just being dug further into poverty. If they don't have their car because it's been seized, then they're not able to get to work. Or if they don't have even like a small amount of money, $30 to $50 that was in their wallet, and because it was seized as a civil asset forfeiture, that means that they might not be able to, pay their babysitter or pay daycare. And so it just kind of creates this cyclical process where people who are already in poverty and struggling are just, further and further dug into that hole. So I was really happy about those things that we accomplished in public safety. And believe me, they were all very hard fought for. This is not an easy process, even to get those small things done. And the same is true with climate and energy. I was on the Commerce and Energy conference committee as we went into negotiations with the Senate. And I can tell you, I say with great sadness that none of my 5 energy bills were passed this year, not one of them. But I think that we did get some really great things accomplished in this realm. The Natural Gas Innovation Act, which allows gas utilities to pursue innovative resources to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. That was funded. We extended the cold weather rule, which is, where we say that utility companies can't shut off your heat. And so we extended that by 2 weeks in the fall, which is also important because we know that nobody deserves to freeze to death, especially children. We finally got solar on schools, which was an amazing accomplishment. I know it's something that we've been working on for a really long time. And not only do we get solar on schools, but now we also have solar on community colleges, which is just a great bonus, I guess. And then the one that I really love is the Energy Transition Office that's being funded. So it's going to lead the effort to support impacted communities and impacted workers as we transition to clean energy. So it really impacts greater Minnesota and all of those communities that are built around either natural gas or different forms of dirty energy, and helping them to develop in ways that are going to be beneficial for them, so we're not leaving them in the dust. And the way I always think about it is we think of like the Appalachians and those communities that were, thriving coal communities. And as coal moved away, they were just left there with nothing. And people were starving, living in huts. I mean, it's a horrible situation. And we don't want to see that for anybody in the state of Minnesota. And so that's why we're really putting our money where our mouth is and investing to make sure that those communities are able to pick themselves up, find something else, either be trained in something that's green technology or in a different industry, so that we can make sure that nobody goes hungry, nobody's living without heat or electricity, and that we are able to care for all Minnesotans regardless of, how we're moving forward with clean energy. I will say I had a couple of bills that I passed that I was really excited and proud about. One was the elimination of statute of limitations for certain sex crimes. And I'm particularly proud of that one because I had a constituent who came to me who was a survivor of sex crimes and who was really passionate about this issue. And I was just a joy, as much as it can be, to walk through that process with him and to, be alongside him every step of the way to get this bill passed. We also, my bill on regulating no-knock warrants was passed, which was really exciting. And then Cassie's Law, which is something that has, again, been in the works for many years. This would be a pre-sentence investigation for traumatic brain injuries. So hopefully looking at whether or not folks have traumatic brain injuries that impacted the way they behave. And we want to do that in pre-sentencing of criminal cases so that we can get those folks the help they need and not just lock up people who have mental health concerns or traumatic brain injuries that are causing them to behave in certain ways. And that was a really moving bill for me because the gentleman who brought it to me was his daughter's been in solitary confinement for going on 4 or 5 months at this point. And she has a traumatic brain injury that has directly influenced how she has behaved, both while she is incarcerated, but also when she's outside in the real world. She has impulse control problems, and that's really directly affected, how she interacts with law enforcement, the behaviors that she has. And so being able to pass even just this feasibility study is incredibly important to me. And I'm really looking forward to seeing how it comes out. And I'm very hopeful that we can start implementing something like this on a regular basis. So that's my little intro. Hopefully I kept it under 5 minutes. Thank you all so much for being here.
Thank
we're
you.
We're ready to go to questions, I think.
Yes, and is Elspeth going to moderate them and call on people?
Yes, I am. And so thank you so much. I'm seeing a ton of great questions in the chat, but also wanted to mention, because I don't think I did at the beginning, that if anyone wants to ask their question, you can use the raise hand function, or if that isn't working for someone, for some reason, feel free to put in the chat that you'd like to ask your question out loud, and I'll call on you to unmute yourself. So let's see, let's start off here with a couple of questions about the eviction tenant and landlord process that we're having right now. The first one I saw was, in Minnesota, is there legal representation for evicted tenants? And then sort of from the other perspective of that, concerns about the tenant eviction notice process. Would that require landlords to be big operators who might need to have a legal slush fund in order to accomplish that eviction process?
So so remind me of the first part again was
The first one was a question. In Minnesota, is there legal representation for evicted
Oh,
tenants?
yes, there is a role for a housing court for attorneys. And interestingly, that's the other group that's some real concern and that was hoping for an off-ramp that would give them some time, because they worried that the volume of people, I think the last I heard,
Di jalanan, mulai bakot tumbuh, sa pusing ding dorang. Saya
I think-
bilang fak, pidom po otak,
Can anyone mute
Can
that?
somebody, yeah, can somebody
para
cut him
Anyone
out?
mute that?
sampai bahasa, mo tabuka
You have
tanay
to kick them
katuto,
out.
sa tidak po.
I think it's yeah.
Sorry about that, folks.
It was a
Okay.
spam. Yeah. Go ahead, Alice.
Go ahead.
The courts have a real concern because they thought if there was an eviction crisis, the workload could be so great that there was no way they had the personnel to respond to it. So there are really three entities that we're trying to protect in this off-ramp: landlords, tenants, and the courts. So yes, courts absolutely do play a role in this. I wish, however, that we had far more funding to help with that piece. I think that's another piece that we haven't quite dealt with as aggressively as can. The problem is just so big this year that I think it has grabbed our attention. The courts, though, let it be known that they had some anxiety about this. And the other one was, there were two parts of that.
Yeah, the other part of that was concerns from the landlord perspective, wondering if this process would require landlords to be big operators or have legal slush funds to get through
No.
the process.
No, they don't upfront any money. I mean, obviously, they've been struggling with this. That's why we want to get this money to them as quickly as possible, because they have bills to pay. And we have an interest in keeping all of those places, but it is not just for big operators, it's across the board for the small businesses. You know, our landlords are in a sense, some of those small businesses that we're trying, that they were a small business that sort of slipped through the crack with any other help. But this, we hope, is one that begins to help them out. So landlords, tenants, and the courts are all the entities that we're trying to protect.
Great. Anyone else want to speak to anything more on that? It looks like we have someone raising their hand here. I'm going to call first on Eric Meyer, and then I saw Diane, you raising your hand as well, so we'll call on you after Eric.
Hey there, thanks for taking my question. So I was following the negotiations between the House and the Senate on the energy bill. There's one thing that was really frustrating to me, is that the Senate Democrats seem to kind of draw a line in the sand when it comes to nuclear, even though the National Democratic Party is in favor. The IPCC has said we need a 2 to 6 times increase in nuclear by 2050 to meet climate targets. Now the IEA said we need at least a doubling. So all the science is pointing towards the fact that we got to consider nuclear as part of the solution here. But it seems like we're stuck in the mid-90s on this. And I'm wondering, you know, if you have limited political capital and you can, you know, you can only have your core issues that you will not compromise on so many things. Why pick nuclear?
So I'll start with that one. Here's the dilemma. The industry has advanced. What has not happened at all, we have still not done one single thing about where we're going to put the waste. That still falls heavily on all those communities, and they're often indigenous communities. Nowhere in this country have we successfully figured out how are we going to deal long-term with the waste. Nobody has any argument about that, but that's going to happen. I remember going to one meeting and someone from New Mexico said to those of us in Minnesota, if you believe this is a friendly environmental and inexpensive energy, that's fine. You can make that decision. Just think you can dump your waste on us, because that's when it looked like Yucca Mountain wasn't happening. And so then people began to talk about New Mexico. So there is our big dilemma in this country, that we have simply not dealt with the waste issue yet.
And I'll add quickly that I I am not a fan of nuclear. I'm open to it. I'm open very much to it. I see two big issues. One is the waste one and the other is the cost one. And I remember as a kid when electricity was going to be too cheap to meter if we had nuclear. And again, a lot of the things I know technology keeps changing. At some point it may. I just am very concerned. The reason I don't want to do it right now is every time the other states have allowed projects to go forward, they wait until they spend $5 or $6 billion and then they bail on the projects and the ratepayers are stuck with them. I'm saying, hey, if they're willing to put in the thing, but that they have to do it the way any other energy facility, energy generating facility is, where they have to pay, the utility has to pay to put it online, and then they can charge us for the electricity. I'm open to considering that, but again, I'm not excited about doing that until we have some better answer on waste other than we're gonna store it in perpetuity on the banks of the Mississippi River. So I'm not voting to repeal the moratorium until I see progress on that, but I can guarantee you, if XL Energy has some solutions to those things, they will be coming to us and asking us to do it. They're the only utility in Minnesota that has any nuclear power, has the capacity to deal with it. And I'm not hearing from them. They're saying, well, they don't like the restriction because they don't like any restrictions. That's what they've said. But are they pushing for a change? Not really. So I guess I see it as kind of a distraction in a sense from other things we have to do. And to me, the far and away, bar none, the biggest problem is climate change. And I'm not going to disagree with you that it may be part of what we need to do it. I want to see some progress on that to make it happen. In the meantime, I'd like to invest efforts, far more energy invested into efficiency and conservation and continued with the batteries, solar, wind, other renewables. So I'm not ruling it out, but I'm not ready to repeal the moratorium. And I don't think that was a bargaining chip with anything this year. I don't support doing it. And the Senate did pass a review of the moratorium.
Yeah. Just to respond real quickly to that, I'm worried that perhaps the balance between the risk and the threat of climate change and air pollution, for that matter, from coal particulates, is somehow being put on a similar level to nuclear waste, which hasn't killed anyone in the history of it, from commercial power production. This is another situation, of course, and could all fit in a single Walmart, the entirety of the U.S. History of nuclear waste from power production. So I worry that we're kind of leaning perspective of what we're trying to do here. But I'm with you on climate change is the number one threat here. So I hope you guys consider opening the door to all the options here. You don't have to, put a big bunch of subsidies for nuclear or anything like that. But just allowing the conversation to happen, I think, would go a long ways.
Good point. Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thanks, Eric.
Thanks. And now I want to move on to Diane H, because I saw you had your hand up on the screen earlier. So go ahead and unmute.
Yeah, I'm hoping that in this, wonderful plan for the tenants to be protected, the people who absolutely refuse to write anything, whether they cannot read and write English, whether they are afraid that if they put anything official on paper, they'll get deported. I don't know the reason, but the ones who will not put anything in writing, landlord cannot evict. If they refuse to pay rent, but I don't have any proof that they refuse to pay rent, they just didn't do it. There is nothing, and this is all paperwork heavy. I wonder what plans are in place for that.
Yeah, you've outlined very well one of the reasons why it's slow going in the early, some go very, very smoothly. The tenant knows how to apply, works cooperatively with the landlord, and it all goes smoothly. But there is certainly suspicion around this, or in some cases, they don't have the tools for it. And so this early, one, the publicity that this is available, and two, the technical assistance to help the kinds of people that you've just talked about. I think are why our early steps here have been a little slower than we wish. So those points are really well made.
I believe landlords can apply for the assistance on behalf of the residents. You cannot?
Unfortunately, the federal government rule does not allow for that.
Oh, okay, we were going to, okay, so the feds allow, so I understand that's an issue we got to figure out how to get around. Okay, thank you. Thanks for raising, I wasn't aware of that federal rule.
We could still lobby the federal government. I always tell everybody, write your congressional people too, because there are a couple of these rules that could be more flexible at the state level.
Next question.
Great. I'm going to go in the order I saw hands go up. So we're going to go to Ev Hansen Florin next. You can go ahead and unmute yourself or not.
This is about the second train to Chicago. Is there any thought to having that be a high-speed train?
Well, just because of the technical aspects of that corridor, at one point we actually called that high-speed rail. We actually called that corridor high-speed rail. And now, because I don't want to falsely promise anything, I have stopped referring to it as that, and I refer to it as intercity passenger rail. In other words, and it's in a sense another thing we do for climate change. If we provide other alternatives to go the short distances where they don't have to use aviation and cars are two of the big contributors, transportation contributors to climate change. And so providing an alternative for those short hauls seems to be important. But yeah, we at one point dreamed that we would have what Europe had. And I think one, because we're not investing sufficiently, and two, in that corridor, some of the technical aspects, we're not going to reach the speeds that some people think when they hear high-speed rail.
And I want to second that we have to do the high-speed rail, and we're going to have to electrify the rail system. And when President Biden's talking about a mega infrastructure package to deal with things like climate change, we've got a third world train system in this country. It's shameful, and there's no excuse for not having it. And it's not cheap to do it, but it's actually a cheaper mode of transportation if we put what we had in the 1940s and 50s before aviation took over. We had a good investment in it, and we've let the railroads fall, and we've let the passenger rails been secondary to freight rail in all cases. And so basically we're going to have to make a big investment in that. And frankly, I think a lot of people would feel a lot better being able to go to Chicago in 2 hours or less. And other countries can do that. So we got to do it.
Yeah, thank you.
Great, sounds good. Next, I think the person I see next on my screen, the name is Rev Glenn, but I'm not sure that's the correct name.
Oh, my name's Barb Harrington Hall. This is my husband's computer, and I can't seem to change the ID. Anyway, I want to ask you about the two laws that were passed by the House and seem to be stalled for gun violence. I'm a member of Moms Demand Action. We're greatly concerned with the gun deaths in this state, especially since 85% of them are suicides, which is tragic. So has there been any movement in the Senate? I know the House passed the 2 gun bills to close the loopholes, and the red flag bills that would give the police and the courts a way to get guns away from people who might be planning to harm themselves. Has there been any movement in the Senate on these 2 bills?
I'll start with that one. Unfortunately, no action. The Senate majority has a 36 to 31 vote majority. And because people don't 100% vote party line on guns, maybe the Republican Party now does. But it's kind of extremely difficult. We can't get any hearings on any bills. I've been working on a major gun safety legislation package, which recognizes the fact that we've cut the number of deaths by automobile by over 90% per miles driven, over 90% over the last 5, 6, 7 decades. In guns, we don't do any of that. And we can't do any regulation of that according to the Senate. Republicans don't want to accept anything. The chair of the committee won't hear the bills. We've been fighting for at least those 2 little things that the House did. They're good steps forward, but they're a small part of what we have to do. I think it's shameful when we see what's going on in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and other communities around the country, the mass shootings, the individual shootings, the suicides, the accidental deaths where kids get hold of a gun in the household. I think we need to have an adult conversation about guns in this country, and we seem to be unwilling to do that. I'd argue because the NRA in the past, and I think the public opinion has changed. Public opinion may have always been there, but the vocal public opinion has changed now. And I'd say there are enough people who, that if it was put to majority vote, every one of these things, gun safety legislation would pass overwhelmingly in the public. And I'm hopeful we'll see change in the next couple of years.
And to that point, I just want to say thank you, thank you, thank you to Moms Demand Action and all of those other advocacy groups that never give up, that just continue to be there with your voice and with your action. And we are so grateful to partner with you in this work. And we will not be giving up.
We are more determined than ever, so the moms are
Good.
not going away.
Good.
Great. I'd like to turn it over to Diane Peterson if you want to unmute your mic.
Hi, I'm very respectful of Senator Marty and Representative Hausman, who I've known from the mid-1990s for their environmental advocacy. And I have a question for my representative, Athea Hollins. I'm very tired, I'm sure, as Senator Marty is, hearing that old argument against his Minnesota health plan, where opponents to it say that it's politically unfeasible, even though it's very popular among Americans, that they want a reasonable, affordable, guaranteed health plan that's low cost and that guarantees people for life. So, Representative Hollins, Senator Marty's bill for the Minnesota health plan, which is popularly known as a single payer health plan, would you be willing to publish a public written statement explaining your position and support for that healthcare policy?
Yeah, absolutely. I've been in support of it. You know, Senator Marty and I have talked about it. I'm a big fan. I think that it absolutely needs to go forward. I believe I signed on as a co-author on the House version of it. So yes, 100%. I am 100% behind doing that, and I will write any statement that you request of me. And I think that like now is the time more than ever, but this pandemic just hit us, where we know that we're only as safe and healthy as our neighbors are. It's clearer than ever that we need to have something that covers everybody, because literally our lives are at stake.
Oh,
So yeah,
I'll be in touch later. We'll try to get something into our local papers.
I would love that.
Great, thank you.
Thanks.
And
And
I'll
I think
add, go ahead.
I think our pandemic demonstrated again the dilemma. If you turn money and power over to the insurance companies, you aren't solving problems and you're making some things much worse. And we have felt it so keenly in the last year and a half. So I'm hoping it sort of ignites a fire under efforts to reform a very broken system.
And I'll add two other related comments, one of which is COVID was a perfect illustration why we need universal health care. Providing health care to 90% of the public is really great when you have an infectious disease. 10% of the public are not going to deal with you. Fortunately, at both the state and national level, people jumped in very quickly and said, oh, no, we're going to cover everyone. No co-pays, no anything, no obstacles to getting care. If you need a vaccine, if you need a test, you need other things, it's covered 100%, because in public health, you need everyone to get care. And as far as the cost of it this year, because I couldn't get any hearings or anything, any attention from the Senate on it, on the Health and Human Services bill, I tried to take some money that they were providing, $1.5 million they were providing, to require medical assistance patients to get their drugs at pharmacies in Minnesota, because a lot of them were getting them through mail order or things like that. It would cost us $1.5 million more just to require low-income people to get their things in Minnesota. If you lived in Warhead, you couldn't buy them in Fargo and so on. And I said, well, it was basically paperwork to make sure the prescription only went through at certain pharmacies. I said, why don't we take a third of that and do a study of our Minnesota health plan compared to the everything else? It was voted down. It was a party line vote. I was pleased every Democrat stayed in support of it. And my pitch to the Republicans was, if you think it's too expensive, why don't you want to study? Why don't you let us study it and show the numbers? Anyhow, it didn't get anywhere this year, but I'm sick of this. Every other country seems to cover everybody, and we can't do it. And we spend twice what any other country in the world spends. I mean, there are about 8 exceptions that, and they spend far less than us. But we could provide better health care at a lower cost, excluding nobody, and including dental and everything else. And even the idea of studying it, nope, we can't do that.
In the
Yeah.
Pioneer Press, within the last week, there was an article about some work Angie Craig is doing on this issue. And she used a specific case. I believe the young woman's name was Angie Kruger. I may not have the first name right. And what happens in this particular period where you lose jobs, you lose insurance. In one case, the birth of twins was imminent. So if that is it, just to see the complexity of a particular case, if any of you can Google that article within this past week in the Pioneer Press, and it was specifically focusing on some work that Angie Craig is doing.
And the one thing I'll add to that is, you know, the ramifications of our public health system and what happened with the pandemic are going to go beyond just testing and vaccines. Like we know there's long-term care that's going to be involved in this, and you know, Senator Marty's plan would cover that, and I think that's really important, as well as the mental health and addiction services that would be provided, because we know that there's been increase of overdoses. We know that people are suffering from mental health crises because of being isolated and because of all the transitions that we've had to make during this pandemic. So if there was ever a case for this health plan going into place, we're here. This is it. I mean, we have to do it. So sorry, I'll stop talking now.
I'll say that what Athea just said also seconds what she said earlier about how traumatic brain injury and frankly mental health issues, we treat them as crimes. Drug addiction issues, we take those health issues and we treat them as crimes. And it's because we can't get people the care they need, because people who are addicted to medication, people with traumatic brain injury, people with mental health often cannot get the care they need. And if we make it something for everyone, it will do so much to take it out of the courts and so much to give people care they need in medical facilities. Next question, maybe.
Yeah. Kate, if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself. And then after that, I think we'll go to the chat for a few questions, because I see some good ones there that I want to get to.
I'm looking forward to a discussion of Lynn's question. Thank you, Lynn Middleton Kohler. Not quite as important, but still important, is the question about, if we're going to have transition for energy, employees of energy utilities, which I think is just fine. But are we going to find a way to actually, bring in people who are Black, Indigenous, and people of color to be workers? I worked on a study, and especially in Greater Minnesota, but also in the Twin Cities, the utilities are complying with their affirmative action goals because there aren't people who have been trained to take these jobs. And that it would be wonderful if the utilities had workforces that reflected communities that they serve. So that's my question.
Yeah, I think that's 100% correct. We've looked into some of those statistics, right? And they're like, well, there's nobody applied, or there were 2 people who applied, and statistically we did pretty good. But the reality is, like you said, that people from certain communities are not being trained in this. They're not being recruited to those particular careers, which can be really lucrative. And so we need to start a little bit earlier in what we're doing. I know there were several bills that were targeted at doing exactly that. They did not get included in the Commerce and Energy Omnibus, unfortunately. I believe there was a lot of pushback when it came to those provisions, specifically from utility companies, right? I mean, it's not the community that's pushing back on it. unfortunately. I think most people would agree with you that that's something that is needed and it's a good idea, and it would be a fairly easy problem to solve statistically, you would assume. But of course, anytime that we put any more regulations or expectations, we get a lot of pushback. And so, we're going to keep chipping away at it. I think you're right, though. Like, this is, it's great that we're looking out for greater Minnesota. And of course, we represent, as representatives and senators, we represent the entire state of Minnesota, right? And so we want to take care of everybody. But in part of that, we have to acknowledge that there's been a lot of communities that have been historically and systematically excluded from, being a part of these lucrative careers, and we need to rectify that. So thank you for bringing that up.
Elspeth, you wanted to go to the chat room? Is that it?
Yeah, I was going to bring up actually the question from Lynn, because it was mentioned, and I've seen some other people referring to it in the chat as well. Lynn's question is, how do you account for the silence from the governor's office regarding Line 3 and Bridge Line 3 in response to issues of treaty rights, water protection, impact on climate change, co-opting of law enforcement?
Good question. It's been a big frustration. I was up northern Minnesota related to this last December, and been very frustrated at the Public Utilities Commission's rulings on it, because I think they did a poor job on it, and I think the courts have been challenging that many times, and I'm disappointed that the administration did not continue to pursue the appeals on that. I think the reason Line 3 becomes such a big issue, and I think it's important to put in perspective because a lot of people may not be tracking it, but that pipeline, which uses some of the dirtiest, the tar sands oil from Canada, the output of that oil from the pipeline, when you count the extraction of it, the processing of it, the transporting of it, which is hard to do because it's really thick, gummy stuff, the transporting of it and the burning of it will put out more greenhouse gases than the entire Minnesota economy. That's not going to Minnesota, it's going elsewhere. It's just going through Minnesota. And the greenhouse gas impact of that is greater than the state of Minnesota, all of the businesses we go to, all the schools, all of our households, everything in the state of Minnesota puts out less greenhouse gases in a year than that pipeline would. And so saying we're making progress on energy efficiency or rooftop solar or whatever, all of that is blown away by the additional impact of this pipeline. And so I'm very disappointed we haven't had more action on that. And I think it's going to be up to the courts and maybe the president. He did stop another pipeline earlier this year, and this one's the same sort of deal. And it's not like we are cutting off oil immediately. We can't. It's part of our economy right now. But locking in a new pipeline that's taking the dirtiest oil and going to be paid for over the next 40 years is something that really destroys our chances of getting a solution to climate change.
Here's a little bit of good news to your question, though. Your question was, why isn't the governor providing stronger leadership? Up until now, neither the governor or the lieutenant governor had, but this week, the lieutenant governor came out with a very strong statement in opposition and detailed her reasons for that. So that I saw that as a good first step, that to hear from the lieutenant governor with such a very strong statement.
Yeah, and my mom taught me that if I don't have something nice to say, I shouldn't say anything. So I think I have to keep my mouth shut on this one. But suffice it to say, I'm very frustrated with the situation. And, it's not just me and it's not just us three. There are a number of legislators who are frustrated with the situation and continue to push. And to answer the question that just popped up from Lynn, I don't know. I suspect no. I don't think that the lieutenant governor necessarily has the governor's ear. I know she had stated before in public hearings that, or not public hearings, but in public events that she was against it. I was glad to see the statement as well, as Chair Hausman said. But you know, whether I think it's going to make a substantive difference, I'm not convinced. So sorry, that's not very cheery. I apologize.
On what hopefully is a more cheery note on environmental issues, Brad has asked, what is the status of clean cars?
Okay, the final bill on that did not make any changes in it. The administration has been moving forward on rulemaking. The clean cars legislation basically states have the federal standards which have been in place since the Clean Air Act, or we can choose between an alternative which was developed by California, which they started clean air standards before the federal government did. So the federal government said, okay, you can do what you want. You can keep doing what you're doing. You can keep modifying them. And other states have the choice. There are two standards. They can go with California's standards or the federal ones. I was hearing a bill with the now Speaker of the House 15 years ago trying to get this. We tried 3, 4, 5 years, could not get it. President Obama took federal law administrative action and almost accomplished probably 3/4 or more of the clean car standards at the time. And then President Trump undid it. So we've had to do it again. Thought we were going to have more legislative fights, but instead Governor Walz recognized he can do it administratively. So he's been working on it on a couple of years. The Senate Republicans wanted to, matter of fact, they threatened to shut down state parks and campgrounds this 4th of July weekend and everything if they didn't get their way on that, but they did get in on that in the end. And basically it was a thing they couldn't agree to, so we kept the current status, which is those rules are being developed and they will take effect in the next couple of years.
And I will say, I'm very excited about clean cars, but the timing of that on the federal level was a huge reason why we couldn't get more put through with electric cars in the omnibus bill. There was a ton of pushback, and we had a number of different electric car provisions that were pretty uncontroversial that got slammed down when we got to the Senate because as retaliation for clean cars. So that's unfortunate, but here we are.
I'm seeing a number of questions sort of around issues of public safety and judiciary. So I thought we'd move on to those. I see a question about the statute of limitations on certain sex crimes, wondering about more details as to what types of crimes it will affect and when the law will take effect, if there'll be any time limits on that.
Sure, yeah, that's a fair question. So it will affect, it removed the statute of limitations for sex trafficking and for, I want to make sure I get this right. It is criminal sexual conduct in the first, second, third, and fourth degree. So you would have to look specifically at those statutes to see what that entails. It's usually just a variation of how old the victim was and how close they were, and what interactions they had. And what it does is it eliminates the statute of limitations from September 15th of this year and onwards. So only acts committed on or after September 15th of this year will have no statute of limitations. So it doesn't affect anything going backward. There's no backdating of it. It's just things moving forward. Fair question, good question.
Yeah, very good question.
And can I make one more comment on that? It's not directly related to statute of limitations, but we also had, there was a push against any changes in some of those laws in the Senate. But the one that finally broke the gap was when there was a case, the Supreme Court ruled that our law as written, everybody agreed it was a bad law as written, but agreed that if a person is intoxicated, that the fact that somebody is sexually assaulted basically means they've consented to it unless they object, even though they are not, they're totally incapacitated. And everybody agreed that was wrong. It was bipartisan agreement. Finally, the Senate Republicans and Judiciary Committee said, okay, we'll make that change. And then some of the members of the committee pushed through a whole range of other changes in the way we deal with sexual assault and so on. So it was a significant progress on some of those issues.
I was gonna say, I felt like the push for police and law enforcement accountability was actually a boon to sexual criminal conduct or criminal sexual conduct reform, because everybody could agree that that's a bad thing. We can't agree on what to do with law enforcement, but everybody can agree that criminal sexual conduct is a problem and we need to reform how our laws look. So in that sense, we did get a lot done on that front, which is great.
And there is a question related to this, I'll just comment on, about a huge backlog in processing rape kits. I still have never figured out, that's a matter of budget issues, and I have never figured out who's opposed to fixing that problem. And it really is obscene when you see what a victim does after a sexual assault, that they go through, and then to understand that all the evidence they provided is sitting on a shelf, never being tested, never being anything else. It's one of the biggest gaps in our public safety, because there have been times when we had evidence, previous offenders who I believe then can continue to commit crimes because we never track them down, because we never followed up on processing the rape kit. So that question is a very good question, and it's one, all I can say is it's long overdue, and I think public and legislators should all be outraged at it.
There's a question here on the policing and public safety scope of issues from Deborah, who says, mental health issues, domestic abuse, and homelessness need something different than a police response, but right now that's the only option. How can this be addressed at the state level? And points to the fact that St. Paul had to cut back the staff in their coast unit due to budget costs, and I believe that stands for Community Outreach Stabilization Units.
We are beginning to see some local cities come up with new approaches and different ways of dealing with this. And they really are mental health units or social workers or something, and they have different ways of responding to the calls as they come in. So we see some early signs of different models that are beginning to take shape. And I think the more we learn from each of those early models, the better the next step can be. So I think we need to pay attention to those early reform efforts in some of the cities.
And I'll add that I have a bill, I'm trying to find the bill number and I'm not finding it. Oh yeah, Senate File 2403 would be providing cities that take a look at providing other professionals to address public safety concerns like that, would have state funding available to help match that funding. It's actually, we shouldn't need that other than to get started in it, because it's actually cheaper. People have been, Minneapolis is now pointing to what Eugene, Oregon has done, where they've had for 30 some years, mental health teams that go out for calls that are appropriate for them. Less than 1% of them, these are often very dangerous situations, but less than 1% of the time do they end up calling law enforcement in that. And we've seen that in Roseville. We've had a mentally ill person who was being welfare check on him, and he ended up dead from a police shooting several years ago. We urgently need to do this. What my bill, Senate File 2403, would do is say, look, we can have an alternative professional response. Sometimes as a social worker, sometimes as a mental health professional, sometimes it's an administrative person. A whole range of people. We want the appropriate professional. Law enforcement professionals have their niche, but we don't need them to be doing everything else. And even in a George Floyd kind of situation where there's a bad bill passed, somebody told me, if a white person passed a bad bill and they notify police, they probably track down the person and give them a call and say, you passed a bad $20 bill. Where'd you get it? And they try and investigate instead of arresting the person for a $20 bill that may have been, let's assume it was a phony bill, but it may have been a fraudulent bill. But you don't need to send an armed person to talk to somebody about that. There's administrative things. And so I think we have to do that. My legislation was an attempt to get the state to push local governments and law enforcement to have other professionals respond to emergency calls.
Yeah, and I worked with Senator Bigham on a bill that was around the data protection for individuals who might be receiving services from any of those alternatives to policing. So like mental health crises professionals, social workers, et cetera. Because what's really interesting is, well, it's interesting to me, and I didn't think about this before being in the legislature, is that all of that information is public when you interact with a police officer, including things like your mental health status, right? And so you really have to change how we think about data practices. So you're not reading the newspaper and you see the blotter and see that your neighbor was in the middle of a mental health crisis, because that really shouldn't be, the general public's business. And so we were looking to try to make that information more confidential so that people would feel safer about calling these, dual, I forget what they're called. But, when a police officer and a mental health professional come together to work with you. So people would feel safer and less nervous about it, because if you talk to people who do have mental health problems or crises, well, we all have mental health problems, but they will tell you that one of the things they're afraid of is having that information be public and being scrutinized for it, not getting a job because it shows up when you Google it somewhere. And so making sure that that information is kept as confidential as possible and is only shared with, organizations or entities that are providing that mental health care is really important. So we're going to have to do some work on that end. We're definitely going to have to rethink how our systems are set up, but I totally believe it's possible. And I see a lot of different, smaller cities and towns working for it.
Absolutely. I see we have Nancy raising a hand here. So Nancy, if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question. Nancy,
You're not unmuted.
Okay. Nancy might be having tech problems, so I think we'll move on to another question, and maybe if we can read. Question here from Diane about voter restrictions and redistricting. Did we get enough census info to fight redistricting?
Well, we're very far behind in the process because of some of those early glitches in the census counts and reporting. And so I think there's a bit of an anxiety about the timeline now being pushed. And I think most of us are fairly sure it's going to end up by having a group of judges do this again, which tells us we ought to be more organized about this and have an independent commission that we move to rather than continue this farce that isn't working anymore.
And I'll add that the federal census numbers, I think, are expected to, the final ones are expected to be coming in September or so. They were tied up, and I'll argue largely because of COVID, but there were other factors as well. But when they come in, then the work begins happening. A lawsuit by, I think, illegal men voters and a former Senate attorney have asked the courts to say, look, the legislature is not going to succeed at redistricting by next February 15th or whatever the normal deadline is, because the legislature is not even convening next session until January 31st or so. And they've asked the court to step in. And the Chief Justice did appoint a panel, 5 judges. 2 of them were appointed by DL governors, 2 by Republican governors, and a 3rd one by Jesse Ventura, Independence governor. And so it's a neutral panel by party of appointment of the judges, and they are asking them to say, hey, don't wait until February 15th. The process works much better. Why don't you prepare something and then be ready to release it then if the legislature doesn't have something by February 15th, because I think we all agree it. But it's not going to be fought. The good news is it's not likely to be gerrymandered by the legislature. Last 3 or 4 cycles have been always done by the courts. And I agree, I support a redistrict commission, but in the meantime, better them than have a partisan gerrymander, which is a huge problem in Wisconsin and numerous other states, along with other voting restrictions.
We've got a question here from Yakasa, who's asking about gaps in education outcomes, and specifically the free and reduced meals program, and stigmatizing poor and working class students, or leaving students with lunch debt. Are there proposals addressing that?
I can start with that because there are so many contributing factors to this, and we have to be working on all of them. I'll speak to the one I work on, and that is housing stability. The University of Minnesota did research a number of years ago and determined that by the time a child reaches 5th grade, if they've been homeless or highly mobile, they're achieving at the level of a 2nd grader who's been in stable housing. That's one of the contributing factors. So that's a piece that we need to be working on. I'll let others speak to. We probably have a half a dozen we can add in here.
I'll add something if Athena's not going to go right now. I wanted to say that California announced a couple weeks ago, they passed legislation that will provide school lunches for all students, period. You won't have the free and reduced, it'll be everybody is covered. And that to me gets to a whole lot of the disparities, the lunch shaming, which we've outlawed in the past, and then, oh, they find new ways to shame. I mean, it's embarrassing what they've done to people. But on top of that, some school districts learned several years ago, whenever they have standardized tests that you compare schools with and so on, schools learned, you know, if we provide free breakfast to every student, students with full stomach actually do better on the tests. So schools have been providing free breakfast to everyone on those days, which begs the question, what about all the other days when they're supposed to be learning? And the whole concept, I mean, I think it's shameful that the way students can get a good diet is to get school meals. But during the COVID thing, I think we got to say the St. Paul School District really deserves a ton of praise. They've been one of the best in the country in terms of making sure they get meals out to students every day, make it available to everyone. Local elementary school I drive by here, it's in the Mounds View School District, but I see they have free lunches for all kids under 18 for the rest of summer. And that's a huge thing. It's a lousy way to address hunger. But if we've got hungry kids, that is one of the biggest factors in disparities. And I'd say, look, what California is doing is right. And it's going to save them money, and it's going to have better educated kids. And so, like Alice, the housing, the education, the nutrition, all of it ties together. And it's a really good question because we have, quote, better than average schools in the country, but greater than average disparities. And so students of color are doing less well than students in other states even. So it's shameful, and we got to change it.
Yeah, I don't think that I am going to add anything to this conversation that hasn't already been said. The one thing that I will note is that I feel that when we look at all of our funding for everything, but especially things like schools, we really come at it from this place of scarcity of how much can we invest into this in order to make it like better, as opposed to like, this is an investment in our future, in the future of our state and our communities. And I don't think we should be looking like, how much can we get away with? I think we should really be looking at like, how much can we give? Like, let's just, as much as we possibly can, because, you know, everything is going to flow from that. Everything, and it's all tied to exactly what Alice was saying and what Senator Marty was saying, you know, the housing and the healthcare. I mean, it's all tied together. You can't separate it. So I fully believe that we can't invest a ton of money into one area and not invest in another. And when I look at schools and when I talk to people, and I have a school-age child, I'm just disheartened by the question of what do we need to get better, as opposed to how do we just make it work? Like, why are we looking at like how to make the numbers inch up, as opposed to just throwing everything we've got at it and then saying, okay, either that's going great or it's not going great, but like, how do we get there from that point? So I would, I mean, I guess I'm probably preaching to the choir right now, but this is my personal philosophy is, you know, you can't invest too much in kids. You can't have too great of teachers. You can't have teachers that are, you know, we have professional sports players that make thousands of times more than what a teacher does. And are we really saying that a professional football player is worth that as a human being compared to a teacher? I really hope that none of us on this call are saying that.
And this is why we don't want to go back to normal after the pandemic. Normal wasn't working.
Yes.
We have to learn and do it better.
Great. Well, I think we're planning to wrap up shortly here, and I, excuse me, I think we've got into most of the questions in the chat. I do know I'll put in contact information for folks if there's anything that you want to follow up on. I did see a good sort of closing question here that was directed to Representative Hollins, but thought it could maybe be expanded to everybody. As a freshman legislator, what surprised you most about the legislature, and what types of constituent supports, or I would expand that to, you know, contacts or ways to reach out, were most helpful to you? So if Representative Hollins, you want to take that, and if the more senior members have things to add as well, that'd be great.
Sure, thank you. Wow, that's a question. How do I answer it without getting into trouble? I think probably the most surprising aspect of this for me was how big our tent as a DFL is, and how big our tent just in general with the legislature is. I mean, there are just some wildly varied perspectives and life experiences, and it makes it really interesting, but it also makes it really difficult to find common ground. And so to me, that was maybe the most surprising aspect of it, was how do we come together and say, this is something we can all agree on. Here's a value that we can agree on. And now what does it look like moving forward? Like, how do we bring policy into this space with values that we agree on? And it's not impossible, which is what I learned. It's not impossible, which is fantastic. But it was definitely surprising how varied the range was. And then I guess the other, for me, like, communicating with constituents is 100% my favorite part of the job, is hearing from people who are politically engaged and who have opinions on things. Even if I don't agree with them necessarily, I love hearing from constituents. And I think some of our best interactions have actually been over Zoom, because it just makes it easy to have a quick phone call or have a Zoom call and see each other's faces and talk about things. But also, you know, I love emails. I don't care that it's a form email. Go ahead and send me your form emails. I just care that you care. That's what's important to me, that you take the time to say something. So I would encourage people to do that. But also, you know, if you want to have conversations, and now that I am fully vaccinated, and hopefully you're fully vaccinated, if you're not, you should be, we can get together for coffee too, or walks around Lake Como or something like that. So, you know, we have a wide array of ways that we can interact with each other, and I'm hoping that we get to do exactly that.
And I just want to underscore what she talked about in terms of the importance of our communication with constituents, because we really are partners in this work. We need each other. We need you to be out there advocating and educating and speaking to us. And you need us to be in the right place at the right time, doing the right thing on your behalf. So we are partners in this work. And so opportunities to communicate in this way, I think, strengthen that partnership.
I'll add first, in terms of a couple of things Athena said, one about the diversity of opinions at the legislature. It really is a good learning experience. And I really think it's fair to say, it's hard to say at times, but that there probably isn't a member of the legislature that couldn't teach me something. And I couldn't learn something from their perspective. Sometimes they disagree on 99.9% of the issues, but you know, they said something that really resonates, that you can understand where they're coming from. And I think that's extremely valuable. What scares me now is how many people have now got in, oh, the fake media or the whatever, and they listen to certain news sources that are more propaganda sources than news. And so we have all the disputes about safety of vaccines. We have all the disputes, which there are risks to vaccines. It's again, we got a huge, huge risk of COVID. Talking about all those things, we need standard sources of, and I don't know how we get there, but where we can agree to certain facts that we work from. Instead, now it's kind of attack somebody else's stuff and say they're telling lies and throw out your own stuff. I mean, it really is a dangerous world because there are no filters and everybody can, I can, if I want to, spew all kinds of, you say all kinds of things that may not be true. And there's no way to filter what's true and what's not true. And that's why we have so many problems with this COVID crisis where it's become a partisan issue. And the other thing I wanted to take from what Athena said earlier about we've been operating at the Capitol way too much in a mode of scarcity. Somebody had, some author put out the thing that you have the model of scarcity versus the model of abundance. And I think what we need is a society that recognizes there's enough resources in this world, in this state, to make sure every kid gets a good education, make sure everybody has affordable health care and decent housing. There are adequate solutions. Instead, if we try and say, well, we don't have resources to do it, then we make our problems worse and our society keeps crumbling. So I think that's huge and an important thing we have to keep in mind. I really think let's look at things from a model of abundance instead of a model of scarcity. And it works because it is cheaper in the long run. The final thing I'll say is, yes, I agree with both of Alice and Athena. Constituent connections are important. And while they may be through Zoom or email or phone call, instead of less visits, the Capitol is opening up again. We welcome that. We will be having more town meetings that are in person, I hope too, but as I've seen in the chat, lots of you are saying, hey, don't forget this too. And maybe we'll try and do some hybrid ones where we, if people want to, can be in person and others can observe and participate and ask questions through Zoom. It's a new technology. We're learning the new tricks. We have to live with it. We've got a new changed world now. So thank you again, all of you, for participating. Anything
Yes,
else?
thank you.
Alice?
Thank you. I feel the same. Thank you very much for being part of this and for your ongoing communication with us. Very, very important to keep that communication going. Thank you.
Yes, thank
Good
you.
night.
Thanks, Anne. I've put links to the contact pages for all the members here in the chat as well, if you want to use those. And appreciate everyone sticking with us through a few different technology challenges. But thanks everyone for coming.
Thanks.